Parents, it's Lisa Honold here, Director for the Center for Online Safety. We help parents keep their kids safe online. Today, I'm here with guest expert Rachel Bailey. She's a parenting coach and my friend, and I'm excited to have her on today to talk about something that parents struggle with, something that they're always asking me, and it's about how to get kids off of screen time without the meltdown, without the tantrums, without the big power conflict that happens when we're asking them to do something they don't want to do. So welcome, Rachel.
Thank you. Thanks for having me here.
Absolutely. So we're going to talk about this and I'm excited to dive in. Before we do that, I would love to have you introduce yourself, Rachel.
So first of all, I'm a mom. I have two kids who are 8 and 10 as I'm recording. And in addition to being a mom, I have a background in clinical psychology. I have my master's degree in clinical psych, and I've done a lot of things in the field of psychology. I actually started my career working directly with children and adolescents. So I was an ADHD coach. I was a therapist. But what happened was I was working with kids in a number of different capacities, and parents kept coming up to me and asking me questions like, Rachel, how do I get my kids to get off of their devices? Or how do I get them to get their shoes on or get out of the house? How do I deal with anxiety or low motivation? So I realized a few years into my career that parents really needed these practical strategies. And that's something I love about you too, Lisa. It's because you know that we want this, like, what do I say? What do I do? So about 10 years ago, I actually stopped working with kids and teens and I started working with parents. And the last thing I will just say is that when I was in graduate school, my goal was to become a neuropsychologist. I actually didn't become one because I got pregnant along the way, but I was studying the brain. And so what I've done is, now that I work with parents, I take what I know about the brain and all the research I've done even since graduate school, and I really make it into practical action steps that parents can take to improve the behavior, moods, and attitudes in the home. So that's a little bit about me.
I love your philosophy. And yes, we are aligned in how we come across the positive and the practical things. We want parents to really take action and be successful in their actions. Yeah. So I am so glad you're here. One of the things that you're known for is the Yuck Factor. You talk a lot about the Yuck Factor, both from the parenting and the child perspective. And I would love for you to elaborate on that.
Yeah, the Yuck Factor is a really important concept, and it plays such a huge role in the energy in our homes and behaviors and moods and attitudes. And most people aren't aware of it. And I talk a lot about long-term change. I have a podcast where I talk about your parenting long game. And if you aren't aware of the Yuck Factor, you don't get long-term results. So the Yuck Factor is a really simple principle that when human beings are in a good place, we behave positively. So from a parent's perspective, if our kids are being frustrating, and we're in a good place, we probably handle it in a way that we don't regret later. But if we're not in a good place, if we're in this place that I call yuck, so yuck is a blanket term I use to describe any type of discomfort. So yuck could be that we're hungry or tired or burnt out from being in a global pandemic or feeling frustrated or annoyed, whatever discomfort, all of that is yuck. And when humans are in yuck, we do not behave positively. This is true of us as parents. This is also true of our children. And the reason we don't behave positively is because what happens is there is a part of the brain that allows us to act mature and responsible. And that part of the brain is called the prefrontal cortex. It's located right in the front part of the brain. And when we are able to access the prefrontal cortex, we can control our impulses. We can think about the consequences of our actions. Again, mature, responsible behavior lives here. So the first thing to think about is the prefrontal cortex does not fully develop until the mid-20s. So that's why children and adolescents are not always mature and responsible. But anyone of any age actually can't access their prefrontal cortex when they are in yuck, because any type of discomfort is interpreted by the brain as a threat. So it'll turn on an alarm. That alarm is our fight or flight response. And when we are in our fight or flight response, this response actually shuts down any part of the brain that it feels is unnecessary for survival. So it shuts down that prefrontal cortex. So what happens is when we are in yuck, we cannot access the mature, responsible part of the brain. So this affects us. When we're in yuck, we yell more. Even though we know yelling doesn't work, we throw out random consequences that we may not even be able to enforce. We do all these things we regret. And the same is true of children. When they are in yuck, they can't do the things they know they're supposed to do. So a lot of parents will say to me, well, my child knows they're supposed to get off the device. We talked about it before. But when they're in yuck, because they were in the middle of a game and they were imagining they were going to finish that level, they go into yuck, their fight or flight response kicks in, and they've basically forgotten anything you've told them before. They don't think about the consequences of the tantrum they're about to have. Even when they know there's a punishment for it, they can't access that part of the brain in the moment. So yuck, to summarize, just plays a huge role in negative behavior, moods, and attitudes. And generally when someone is acting negative or feeling negative, it's because they're in yuck. And if we want to see long-term change, we have to address the yuck.
Oh, I love how you break it down into tiny pieces, and the fight or flight is real. And when I think about how parents, when they're triggered and they're in yuck, and then they ask their child, why did you do that? It's such a bad question for that moment.
Yeah, they don't know. They don't know.
They don't know.
No.
They can't access that part.
No.
And parents at that moment can't access their best thinking either.
Right. And
So
I call that the
it's
cycle
doomed.
of yuck, which is what
The
happens in
cycle.
homes, is that we're in yuck, we do something, puts our kids in yuck, they do something, puts our, and that's a lot of what I do, is help parents get out of this cycle of yuck. Yeah.
Yes, 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 yes. Thank you for explaining that. Oh, I love it. I love it. Now, how do we apply this cycle of yuck? How do we apply this to what question parents ask all the time, which is, how do I get my kids off their devices without World War III?
Yes. And what World War III is a symptom of yuck. It's they're in this place that, again, they were imagining they were going to finish their round, or they feel out of control. There are lots of things that contribute to yuck, but that's all it is. It's a symptom of yuck. Not that that's an excuse. But what we want to do to help kids transition off is instead of working against the yuck, instead of working against kids' brains, which is honestly what we tend to do, we want to work with their brains. So I'm going to explain a little bit about how we can help kids transition so they don't go into so much yuck to begin with. So one of the first things to know about the brain is that it responds really well to consistency and predictability. The brain craves consistency and predictability. So the first thing to start with when it comes to transitioning kids and adolescents off of screens is to make predictable times when they are getting off of their screens. One of the things I highly recommend, and I believe you do too, Lisa, is creating a consistent screen off time. So a lot of parents are saying, well, how long should I let my kids be on screens? And I will say, well, it's actually, especially these days when kids have to be on screens for school and it's like a gray area, I'll say it's easier to enforce a screen off time. And if your kids consistently know they have to get off of the screens at 4 o'clock every day, their brains actually start to, believe it or not, predict that. And it's easier. So the first suggestion I have is to make your screen off time relatively predictable. That's not going to solve everything though. I have a couple of other tips. And that is to know how the brain works is that we are goal-oriented creatures. We want to finish something once we've started. So if a child believes they're going to be able to finish a round of a video game and they have to stop, that's going to cause a lot of yuck. And what a lot of parents will do is they'll say, well, I gave my child a 10-minute warning or a 5-minute warning, but that didn't actually end their engagement in what they were doing. So the timer goes off and you get the, ah! So instead of using these timers, what we want to do is work with the brain by using the rhythm of the activity and creating closure. When the brain senses an endpoint, that's why, like, if we're watching a TV show, we're about to find out if the main character is going to die, and someone comes up to us and says, hey, I need your attention. You're like, no, wait. But once you find out if that character dies, you're like, okay, I can transition because there was closure based on what you were doing. So if we actually teach kids to create closure based on the rhythm of the activity, now this is much easier with TV shows where there's a clear ending point. With video games, what I actually suggest to parents is to teach your kids not to start a video game that doesn't have closure within an hour of dinner time or when they're going to have to transition. And especially when they know how uncomfortable it is to have to stop in the middle, they don't want to start something when there's no closure. So I actually have parents explain to their kids what closure points are. With younger kids, it's a different word. You can just say an endpoint or where it stops, and helping them find closure points. I have one last tip. And so I've talked about creating a consistent time. I've talked about using the rhythm of the activity to create closure. The last tip I have also works with the brain, which is if you haven't created this closure point, but you still need to get your kids off of the device, they still need to get out of the video game, instead of, because the brain likes to stay engaged, it's goal oriented, instead of like yanking them out of the mental space where they are and trying to pull them to the dinner table, walk over, see what they're doing, and say something like, hey, you got to level 4. Why don't you tell me how you got there as we walk to the dinner table? So you're not yanking them out of that mental space. You're helping their brain slowly transition. And it's interesting, when the scenery transitions, it helps their brain transition too. So as they're talking about it and walking to the table, they can transition more easily. So we really want to think about consistency, those closure points, and helping them transition more slowly. Those are tips for working with the brain instead of against it.
Gosh, I love those. That transitioning and talking about something that they're passionate about and they've just been doing and they want to celebrate and they want to continue it if they could, but having that transition as you're doing the next thing lets them know you think that's important too. I love that idea, to continue in that world for a minute and let them talk about what went really well. That's brilliant. And when I think about closure, I think that's what's so interesting about like a Netflix or a program that you binge watch now, because there is no closure. As soon as you finish one episode, it's like, oh, you want the next one? Here you go. And you're like, oh, you got me.
Exactly. And that is so hard for the brain to disengage from that. It's like, I mean, even we can relate to this. If you're writing an email and like, you know what you're going to say, and then someone comes up to you, you're like, no, no, no. It's
Yeah.
so annoying. Yet that's what we do to our kids. And that's what happens with these Netflix. You're so right. Just keeps going. And they're like, no, 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 don't interrupt me. And then we get out World War III.
And then, yeah, 8 hours later.
Exactly. Exactly.
Thank you so much. This has been amazing. Tell people where they can find you, please.
So I do have a podcast, which is called Your Parenting Long Game. And Lisa's actually been on my podcast. You can hear her episode as well. I was honored to have her there. So that's called Your Parenting Long Game. You can find that on any app that you use to listen to podcasts. I also have a Facebook group called Your Parenting Long Game Podcast Community, and I go live in there often with parenting tips. My website is rachel-bailey.com, and you can find out a little bit more. I have some tips on there and a little bit more about how I work with parents if you ever did want any more intensive or supportive work. I have a number of different options that I support parents.
I love it. I love it. And I will link to your website and make sure people know how to get a hold of you.
Thank you so much.
Rachel, it has been a pleasure. Thank you so much for popping in and helping parents out.
Thank you for having me here. I really appreciate it.
Take care.